Hey, sixth graders, welcome to our literature class. We are starting a new story today. We are starting the story called The Race by Victoria Furman, and it begins on page 63. Before we get started, as always, I want to go over some of the literary terms we're going to be talking about while we read and discuss this story. Now, some of them you should already have in your notes, so I'll go over them briefly, but I won't have them on the board. These three that I have on the board, you don't have in your notes yet, so I want to make sure that you get those written down in your notes as we go along. So The Race is page 63 to page 71. When you read it, make sure that you read all of page 63 and the stuff on the top of page 64, because that gives you some background as far as the story goes. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that The Race is written in a style called realistic fiction. Realistic fiction is when everything in a story is believable. There's no magic, there's no talking animals, there's nothing that wouldn't happen in real life. But it's not a real story. It's a made-up story, but it seems like it could happen. The second thing we want to talk about is dialogue. You probably already know this. This is, I think, a thing most kids know by the time they get to sixth grade. But dialogue is written conversation between two or more characters. When you're reading in a story, you can usually tell when there's dialogue because there's going to be quotation marks around it. In a play, everything is dialogue, and so they don't use quotation marks. In fact, that's how you advance the plot in a play, is through dialogue. But in a story, in a short story or a novel, you see it with quotation marks around it. The third thing we're going to talk about is internal dialogue. This is basically when a character talks to themselves. A conversation that takes place inside the mind of a single character. So this is the character kind of having the conversation with themselves in their mind. The other things I want to remind you of are we're going to have onomatopoeia in this story, which we talked about in the last story, so you'll already have that in your notes. That is when a word echoes the sound that it makes. So any animal sound, like the word meow, or the word knock, or the word buzz, or the word whack, or splat, those kinds of words are onomatopoeia. Conflict. Of course, every story has conflict, and this particular story has a lot of it. And it has several of the different types of conflict. So you'll remember that there are two main types of conflict, internal and external. And then within that, the internal conflict is man versus man. That's when a person is having a conflict inside themselves. And then the types of external conflicts are the internal is man versus self. I said that wrong. Man versus self. External, man versus man, which is one character has a conflict with another character. Man versus nature, where the character is fighting something in nature, whether that's a storm or animals or something in nature. Man versus society is a conflict when one person is sort of fighting a government or fighting a system. And then the last one is man versus machine, which is not in this story, where a character would be trying to gain victory over some kind of machine, like maybe a runaway train or a clock or a bomb or something like that. That would be man versus machine. In this story, we're going to have man versus self, man versus man, and man versus nature. So you'll see that. And then, of course, I want to remind you of point of view. We'll talk about whose point of view is this story told from. First person, second person, third person, who's telling the story. And we will talk about a little bit about the plot pyramid. So you'll remember our triangle plot pyramid. That should already be in your notes as well, where we have the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And so as we get into this, couple of things I want you to remember. The theme is not what the story is about, but what the author wants us to know, the bigger idea about the story. And in this story, there are a couple of possible themes I want you to think about as you're reading. One is courage. That seems to be a common theme in many of the stories that we're reading, and it's a popular theme for writers to write about. But in this story, there's another idea for a theme that I want you to think about as you're reading it, and that is the theme of winning. How important is it to win? What is a winner really? How would you define that? And so as we go through this story, you're going to be introduced to a brother and sister named Mark and Debbie, and you're going to learn about Debbie's conflict within herself and her conflict with Mark, and what makes a winner. So we will talk about that some more in class tomorrow, and I'll see you later.